Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing depression and the antidepressant drugs. Okay, right. So we're currently discussing the cause of depression, or at least what is understood of the pathology of depression. Okay, and we're currently talking about the anterior cingulate cortex, which is this portion of cortex that shows up time and time again when you study depression. Okay, it does seem to be the leading piece of cortex, the leading piece of the brain that seems to maybe be dysfunctional in depression. Okay, right. So we've now talked about the fact that the anterior cingulate cortex can be divided up into two portions, the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and the caudal anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, we've talked about the functions of the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and we've talked about its connections. Now I want to do the same for the caudal anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, right. So, the caudal anterior cingulate cortex, its functions are quite different from the rostral anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, it's very involved in cognition. Okay, and remember, depression is not just about the psychological symptoms. It doesn't just have psychological symptoms. The psychological symptoms are, yes, the major characteristic symptoms. I'm sorry, this is a bit low down. The main symptoms are the psychological symptoms. They're the famous ones. Okay, but remember there were also cognitive symptoms. You have changes in what you're thinking. Okay, you start getting these thoughts of worthlessness, thoughts of helplessness, thoughts of suicide. You also have problems with concentration, problems with memory, which we'll come back to. We'll discuss the hippocampus in a moment. Okay, and also slow thought. Okay, so cognitive changes in cognition are important as well. And the other thing is that the caudal anterior cingulate cortex is important in the control of behavior. Okay, and we'll see that it's got connections to other parts of the brain that are very important in controlling behavior, controlling the movements that are made, basically. Okay, and this might explain that psychomotor retardation, which is one of the symptoms of depressive episodes as well. Okay, right. So let's now talk about the connections then of the caudal anterior cingulate cortex, and I think we'll do this on the next page. Okay, we've got space to draw them. Okay, so the connections. So the first connections that I want to talk about are the connections to portions of cerebral cortex which are very important in deciding upon movements, deciding upon what you're going to do, where you're going to go, and things like that. Okay, so it has connections to the dorsal prefrontal cortex. Okay, and I'm going to give you two of the places that it has connections to and then show you both of them because they're both very essential together, basically. So the dorsal prefrontal cortex and then also portions known as the secondary motor cortex. Okay, right. So let me show these on the brain firstly and then I'll discuss what each of these does. Okay, right. So these ones actually can be seen just by looking at the side of the cerebral hemisphere, so let's do that. So let me draw a picture then of the cerebral hemisphere viewed from the side here. Okay, right. Now one of the key landmarks on the side of the cerebral hemispheres, apart from the lateral fissure here, you also have a crease that runs down the middle and is around here. Okay, and this crease is known as the central sulcus. So basically the cerebral cortex is invaginated in this central sulcus, and this splits the brain into two halves, basically. Okay, right. Now, the reason this central sulcus is very, very important is it allows us to decide on where certain portions of the cerebral cortex are. So in front of the central sulcus lies a very important portion of cerebral cortex, which I'm colouring in red here. Okay, and this is what's known as the primary motor cortex. Now I haven't put as one of the connections the primary motor cortex, but I'm telling you about the primary motor cortex because of its involvement in the motor system, so that I can correctly put the secondary motor cortex and the dorsal prefrontal cortex in context. Okay, so this is the primary motor cortex. Now, this is the piece of cortex which contains neurons which sends their axons down the spinal cord to activate motor neurons that have their cell bodies down in the spinal cord. Okay, so this is the portion that actually sends instructions out to move. Okay, but what tells the primary motor cortex what to do? The primary motor cortex sends instructions out down to the spinal cord and then actually initiates movement. Okay, but what's telling the primary motor cortex what to do? Well, it's the secondary motor cortex which sits in front of it. Okay, so there are two portions of secondary motor cortex which I'll highlight up here. So here is one of them in turquoise here, and the other one is here in blue. Okay, right, so this portion in blue here, this is the premotor cortex, okay, and this portion in turquoise here, this is the supplementary motor area. Okay, so I'll put this here. So this is the supplementary motor area. Whoops, forgotten how to spell supplementary. Supplementary motor area. Okay, and for short, the supplementary motor area is often abbreviated as SMA. Okay, now, both the supplementary motor area here in turquoise, or the SMA, and the premotor cortex here in blue, both of those are together called the secondary motor cortex. So these two put together that sit just in front of the primary motor cortex, these are the secondary motor cortex. Okay, these are involved in actually making the motor plan that will initiate the movement. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by a motor plan. Okay, so basically, if you want to do any movement, you need a very, very elaborate contraction of certain muscles. There are potentially loads of muscles that need to be stimulated, and they need to be stimulated exactly to the right amount and exactly at the right time, okay, to make the movement correctly. Okay, that requires a very, very collaborated sequence of action potentials. So you need to fire action potentials down the right neurons at the right time, at the right frequency. Okay, so what comes up with this incredible sequence of action potentials? What generates it? Okay, that incredible sequence of action potentials, that's what's known as a motor plan. That's what people mean when they say motor plan. They mean that elaborate set of action potentials that is going to propagate down a series of neurons at the right time, basically, okay, to cause the movement. What actually comes up with that? Well, it's believed to be the secondary motor cortex, and then the secondary motor cortex sends instructions to the primary motor cortex, so it sends a motor plan to the primary motor cortex, and then the primary motor cortex relays the information down to the spinal cord. Okay, right. Then as we go up, as we go further forward, we get more and more executive, more and more powerful, basically. Okay, sitting in front of the secondary motor cortex here in orange, you then have the area known as the dorsal prefrontal cortex. Now, I should just explain something to you. Dorsal, this word dorsal, in the context of the firstly, I'll tell you what it means in the context of normal anatomy. In the context of normal anatomy, dorsal means towards the back. Okay, so everywhere else, it just means exactly the same as posterior, basically. And then ventral, the other word that goes along with dorsal, that means in everywhere else in anatomy, that just means anterior. Okay, however, not in the brain. Ventral and dorsal mean something different in the brain. The back of the brain is what you would think would be called the top of the brain. Okay, so dorsal means up here in the context of the brain, and ventral means down here. Do not let that confuse you. Ventral does not mean right at the front, and dorsal does not mean right at the back. In the context of the brain, dorsal means towards the top, ventral means towards the bottom. Okay, and that confused me for a long time at first. Okay, so I think it's because really the brain is viewed as being sort of flopped over. It's viewed as though it should be, it should be turned 90 degrees and standing up like this. Okay, and in which case this really would be the dorsal aspect and the ventral aspect, and everything would be nice as in normal anatomy. And then it's viewed as though it's just sort of flopped over. Okay, I think that's the origin of it. And maybe in embryology, it does start off erect in that way, sort of 90 degrees perpendicular, and maybe that's the reason. Okay, and then I think it is like that. I think as it grows, it then sort of flops over, or rather it grows into this sort of flopped over structure. Okay, so I think embryologists are responsible for this silly naming system. Right, anyway, that's why this portion is called the dorsal prefrontal cortex, because it's right at the top, basically, rather than at the bottom. Okay, now this portion is responsible for then deciding what you actually want to do, or at least this is what we think it does. It's involved in saying, okay, I want to pick up that cup of coffee, and then it sends the instruction to the secondary motor areas, okay, I want to pick up this cup of coffee, you find a motor plan to pick up this cup of coffee. Okay, these generate a motor plan, and then they send the motor plan to the primary motor area, which then relays it down to the motor neurons, which will actually make the movement. Okay, at least that's the model. So these two areas then are incredibly involved in actually making movement. Okay, and the caudal anterior cingulate cortex has connections to these two areas. In addition, it also has connections to the posterior cingulate cortex, okay, the portion nearer the back. Right, okay, so those are the connections of the the caudal anterior cingulate cortex. Okay, what we now want to discuss is what does the anterior cingulate cortex actually usually do then, and therefore how could it therefore be involved in the pathology of depression? Well, first things to say is that it is found to be overactive in depression. Why are we even studying this? It's found to be overactive in depression. It's more active than it should be. Okay, so now the next question is, well, what does it do then? What does it normally do? Okay, and when I say the anterior cingulate cortex now, I mean not only the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, but also the caudal anterior cingulate cortex. The entire thing is overactive in depression. Okay, so what does it usually do then in a healthy individual? Well, it's believed to be responsible for the emotional component of pain. Okay, now it's not the conscious, agonizing pain portion of pain. That's the insular cortex. Okay, that's involved in the sort of bit of pain. This is involved in the I wish I hadn't done that kind of bit of pain. The emotional, the feeling sorry for yourself, the I wish I hadn't done that. That sort of part of pain, the emotional, the sadness portion of pain. So this is starting to make sense. Okay, you're getting the sadness of pain without the agony of pain, potentially, if the anterior cingulate cortex is overactive. So sadness of pain. Okay, right. In addition, what else is it involved in? It's also involved in something called cognitive conflict. Okay, now this is one of these awful psychologist terms which I really advise you not to Google, because if you do Google it, you'll get some horrendous explanation that you don't want, that doesn't help at all. Okay, you'll get a psychologist gone mad, basically. So I will try and explain in the most brutally simple way I can what cognitive conflict is. Okay, so the example that is usually given is this example of a fox trying to get a bunch of grapes. Okay, so fox and grapes example I will give. It's got a special name, but I can't remember what it's called. Okay, so fox and grapes. This is the idea that you start off with a fox. So I'll draw a little fox here. Okay, so here is my fox. It doesn't really look like a fox, it looks more like a, I don't know what that looks like, a llama maybe, the head anyway. Okay, so here's my fox. I'll colour it in orange, that'll make it look more like a fox. Okay, right. So the fox comes along a bunch of grapes. Okay, now it does actually look much more like a fox, that's worked. Okay, so it comes across a bunch of grapes that is suspended too high for it to get. Okay, so here is the bunch of grapes. Okay, now it invests considerable time in trying to get the grapes because it wants the grapes. The grapes are fantastic. So initially in its mind is the idea that the grapes are lovely. Okay, they are really tasty. Grapes are tasty. Okay, and it really wants those grapes. It really wants those grapes. Okay, that's the initial belief that it is working on. It really wants those grapes. Okay, so it then invests considerable time in trying to get the grapes. Okay, but it overall fails to get the grapes. The grapes are too high. Okay, then it has to give up at some point. Okay, and then the idea is that it changes its belief system, basically. Often what will happen, well, the idea is that the fox then decides that actually it doesn't want the grapes, it can't be bothered to get the grapes anymore, and then it starts to dismiss the grapes that it doesn't actually want them anyway. So it might dismiss them as the grapes are horrible anyway, maybe the grapes are mouldy. Okay, so the idea is that because it failed to get the grapes, it's now going to change its beliefs. Okay, change its beliefs, okay, because of the scenario that's happened. Okay, so that's really what cognitive conflict is all about. Cognitive conflict is your brain having to change, basically. It's having to change its belief system. Okay, it tries and it tries using the first belief system that the grapes are fantastic and that it wants the grapes, and then it suddenly has to change its belief system so that it doesn't want the grapes anymore. That change, that shift in the paradigm, basically, that the brain is operating on, that is what's known as cognitive conflict. Okay, I don't hope that example has helped. That's the example that everyone always gives of changing paradigm. I was trying to think of examples of this for myself, but every example that I come up with just seems a little bit petty, so I just decided to use this example here. Okay, so it's this idea of changing the paradigm on which your brain is acting. So cognitive conflict, it's involved in having to change your belief system, basically. Okay, right. So this may underlie some of the feelings of potentially worthlessness. Okay, because if it's overactive, then you're continuously feeling that your belief systems are wrong, basically, okay, and that might have emotional consequences because in driving the feelings of worthlessness. Okay, right, related to this very much so is the anterior cingulate cortex is also involved in errors in task performance. Okay, so if you make an error in your in performing a task, okay, the anterior cingulate cortex becomes active. Okay, so maybe it's involved in the emotional part of making an error in task performance, and maybe it's also involved in the emotional part of cognitive conflict, the emotional part of being wrong in your beliefs, basically, and having to change your beliefs. Okay, so what do I mean by errors in task performance? So I can give an example of this from my life. Okay, so if you've ever worked in a lab, okay, you will know that experiments generally have horrendously technical protocols. Okay, and the first time you do an experiment, or the first few times you do an experiment, often you'll make mistake after mistake after mistake, and every time you make that mistake, and potentially it costs the entire experiment, you know, maybe hours and hours of work go down the drain because of a single mistake, you get that awful feeling of why did I do that? Okay, that agonizing feeling of, oh, that's my fault, and now I'm going to have to start again, kind of thing. That's what I describe as the errors in task performance, and I think that is what the anterior cingulate cortex is involved in when people say that it's involved in errors in task performance. It's involved in that emotional agony that you get of knowing that you've done something wrong and knowing the consequences of doing that thing that's wrong. Okay, so again, this might underlie some of these feelings of worthlessness. So you can start to see here from this picture that the anterior cingulate cortex is not really that nice a piece of cortex. It's involved in quite a lot of horrible emotions. It's involved in the sadness that you have with pain, and it's also involved in the sort of anger and irritability that you get from having cognitive conflict and also errors in task performance, or that sort of anguish that you get from these two as well. Okay, so this is starting to make more sense now that maybe this piece of cortex is involved in depression. Okay, and it is our strongest lead that this is overactive in depression, and that's what underlies the depression. Okay, right, now we've spent all this time discussing the anterior cingulate cortex. We're now going to throw the anterior cingulate cortex away. We're going to go on to something totally different now, that I'm afraid I do not have a link between what we have discussed here and what we're about to discuss. We're about to discuss something else that has been found in people with depression, and I can't really put a link between there being problems with the anterior cingulate cortex and this. Okay, so what we're now going to talk about is disturbances in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that are very common in depression, okay? So just as problems with the anterior cingulate cortex are very common in depression, okay? Problems with the HPA axis are also very common in depression. So, I'm going to start off making sure that everyone is familiar with the HPA axis and its involvement in the stress response. Okay, right, so firstly, what does HPA stand for? Well, it stands for the hypothalamic, that's the H, okay, then the P is for pituitary, okay, and then the A is for adrenal. Okay, so this is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, and let's underline it in some nice colours to make it look more interesting. Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, right, so I'm going to start off with a bit more neuroanatomy. Okay, I'm going to start off by discussing the anatomy of the hypothalamus in a bit more detail. Okay, so that we have a good picture of that, and then we'll go back to the stress response. We'll talk about what happens in the stress response, which specific bit of the hypothalamus becomes active in the stress response, okay, and what it's going to release. Okay, right, so the hypothalamus then. Let me firstly just remind you of the brainstem once again. Okay, so drawing the brainstem again, here we have the medulla, here, okay, with the spinal cord below, and again we're looking from the left hand side. Okay, then on top of the medulla you then have the pons, okay, and on top of the pons, we're very familiar now, you have the midbrain. Okay, then perched on top of the midbrain we are seeing the left thalamus now. Okay, and then you have the hypothalamus in this position here. You have the optic chiasm coming down here, then the pituitary stalk, and then the anterior and the posterior pituitary there, and then it connects up like that. Oh, and I've missed off something crucial here that I've missed off on the previous pictures as well. Okay, another landmark is that you have a little sort of process sticking down here, known as the mammillary body. Okay, I apologise for that. That was missed out on an earlier picture. It's not too crucial, and in fact you have two mammillary bodies. It's certainly not crucial for our discussion. We're at no point going to use the mammillary bodies, but it is there. You have two mammillary bodies. You have a left mammillary body and a right mammillary body. Okay, and they're quite important in the memory systems. Okay, for such a tiny little structure, they are actually extremely important. Okay, so let me just label up little portions here. So we are seeing the left mammillary body, but you'll also have a right mammillary body on the other side of the hypothalamus. Okay, so this is the mammillary body. This structure here, this isn't really part of the hypothalamus. This is the optic chiasm here, okay, where the fibers in the optic nerves are going to cross over. Okay, this here is the pituitary stalk, okay, and then at the base of the pituitary stalk you've then got the two portions of the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, and we'll come back to the pituitary in a moment. Right, you do have only one hypothalamus, you don't have two hypothalami, okay, but you do have a left side of the hypothalamus and a right side of the hypothalamus, and this will become more and more important when we look from the top, okay? In fact, when you do look at this from the top, you will wonder why we haven't decided to say that there are two separate hypothalami, a left hypothalamus and a right hypothalamus. You do say that there is just one hypothalamus, but you're going to see that there is a big division between them in the form of the third ventricle. Okay, so let's now look at this picture from above again. So I'm going to draw this picture again where I have the thalami sitting on top of the midbrain, but now I'm going to put the hypothalamus on in front as well. Okay, so here's the midbrain here, with the superior colliculi here, and these cerebral peduncles stretching out in front here. Okay, right. Then, perched on top of the midbrain, we know we've got the two thalami. So here is the left thalamus here, and then here is the right thalamus here. Okay, right. Now, what I didn't stress previously when we were discussing the thalamus and when we had a picture just like this, was that there is a gap in between the two thalami, okay, and that this gap is actually full of cerebrospinal fluid, okay, and it's known as the third ventricle, okay. And in fact, remember when we were discussing the midbrain, there is the cerebral aqueduct, okay, which runs through the midbrain, okay, surrounded by the periaqueductal grey. This cerebral aqueduct is going to be in continuum with this chamber here. So at the back you're going to have a wall that marks the back of the third ventricle, okay, and at the front what you're now going to have is the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus is not just one solid lump sitting here. Instead, what actually happens is the hypothalamus looks like this. Okay, it is a sheet of grey matter that goes like so. You have a left side to the hypothalamus, which is the side that we are seeing here. We're looking at it from this aspect here in this picture, okay, but in fact it's hollow. It's got a great big cavity in the middle between the left hypothalamus and the right side of the hypothalamus, and people do tend to call it the left hypothalamus and the right hypothalamus, but you say that you only have one hypothalamus, not two hypothalami. Okay, right. So all of this is the hypothalamus, and you have this anterior portion of the hypothalamus right at the front here as well. Okay, now, in addition, the hypothalamus actually also makes up the floor of the third ventricle up here. Okay, so it will also have the floor here. So effectively it's like a little tub, basically, which is going to contain the third ventricle. So you will have a floor at the base here, which is all hypothalamus as well. Okay, and now this great cavity that we have got here, which is going to be full of cerebrospinal fluid, this is known as the third ventricle. Okay, right, so that's an important picture that I want you to be familiar with, because when I start talking about the lateral hypothalamic nucleus, in fact I'm going to show the lateral hypothalamic nucleus now. Not the lateral hypothalamic nucleus. We're not going to need the lateral hypothalamic nucleus. The one we're going to need is the paraventricular nucleus. I'm going to show you the nucleus that we're going to need for the HPA axis now. Okay, so there is a little nucleus sitting here, basically, a little area of this hypothalamus sitting here. Okay, and there's one on the left side and there's one on the right side as well, and it's in this sort of position here on this picture. So this is from above, this is from the side. Okay, so we're seeing the left one of these nuclei here. Okay, right, so what's this nucleus called? Well, it is called, this one is specifically the left one, okay, it's called the left paraventricular, and I'll just move this out a little bit, left paraventricular nucleus. Okay, and for short, the paraventricular nucleus can be abbreviated to PVN, P for para, V ventricular, and then N nucleus. Now, I hope you'll agree that it makes sense as a name, okay, because these nuclei are parallel to the ventricle, parallel to the third ventricle here. Okay, so that's the origin of this name, as the paraventricular nucleus. So you have a left paraventricular nucleus and a right paraventricular nucleus, and these two hypothalamic nuclei are going to be extremely important in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, right. So now let me explain what this axis is and what it's involved in. So basically this is going to be a pathway. It's going to be a series of steps which is part of the stress response. Okay, now what do I mean about when I say the stress response? Basically, the stress response is the response to stressful circumstances. Okay, so for instance, if you suddenly became aware that a bear was behind you and was about to eat you, okay, you would initiate a stress response, or it's also sometimes called the fear response. Okay, right. So it's the response that is going to protect you and initiate the behaviour that you are going to initiate in response to that stressful stimulus. It's going to initiate a response that's going to help you get out of there fast or potentially fight the bear. It's going to initiate the fight or flight response. Okay, right. So it involves a lot of other pathways apart from just the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, but we're just going to study this one part of the stress response. So basically, let's start with some stressful stimulus. Okay, so you have some stressful or dangerous stimulus, stressful or fearful stimulus. Okay, what will happen is the brain will process this stressful or fearful stimulus, okay, and it will send information about this stimulus to a portion that we have already talked about, which is the amygdala. Okay, so remember the amygdala was that little portion of brain that was in front of the hippocampus, located within the temporal lobe. Okay, I'll get a little picture of that up. So this was the amygdala here. Okay, right, and the amygdala, what the amygdala will do is it will decide whether this stimulus requires a fear response, whether it warrants a fear response. Okay, so the amygdala gets information about all sorts of stimuli present within the environment. So it's not just fearful stimuli that are sent to the amygdala. The amygdala will receive information about a book that's been presented to you. Okay, what the amygdala then does is it decides, is this stimulus dangerous or not? Does it require a fear response to be initiated to it? Okay, now if the stimulus really is stressful and does warrant a fear response, then the amygdala will decide, absolutely yes, we're going to initiate the fear response. Okay, now one of the components of the fear response is going to be the activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, so what the amygdala is going to do is, in the fear response, one of the little portions of this is it's going to activate the paraventricular nuclei. Okay, and there are two amygdalas. There's a left amygdala and there is a right amygdala. Okay, and you're going to activate both the left paraventricular nucleus and the right paraventricular nucleus. So we're now going to activate the paraventricular nuclei. Okay, so what do the paraventricular nuclei do when they are activated? Well, they are going to secrete something known as corticotropin releasing hormone. Okay, and now comes the part where we need to discuss the pituitary gland in a little bit more detail. Okay, so basically there are two portions of the pituitary gland. Okay, there is this anterior portion of the pituitary gland here. Okay, so this is the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, and then there is the posterior pituitary gland here. Okay, right. Now, the pituitary gland secretes a huge number of very important hormones, and the secretion of these important hormones is completely under the control of the hypothalamus. Okay, now, the posterior and anterior pituitary are very different in the way that the hypothalamus controls them. Okay, we'll begin with the posterior pituitary, which is the one that we're not actually going to be concerned with in this case, but I just want to explain it anyway. In the case of the posterior pituitary, there are not actually separate cells that make up the posterior pituitary. Instead, what happens is neurons that are in the hypothalamus send their axons down the pituitary stalk here, and then they have their axon terminals in the posterior pituitary, and then when these neurons in the hypothalamus become active, they just fire action potentials. Their neurons release molecules, and these molecules themselves are the hormone, and those molecules go into the blood. So in fact there's not separate cells down in the posterior pituitary. All there is the axon terminals of the neurons that were up in the hypothalamus, okay, and they release neurohormones, as they're called. So when a hormone is secreted by a neuron, it's called a neurohormone. Okay, so the two key examples of neurohormones released by the posterior pituitary, and I'm going to put a little bit of colour on here. The two key examples of neurohormones are oxytocin, okay, which is important in triggering labour, okay, and also the antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin, ADH. Okay, so these are the two major hormones released by the posterior pituitary. Okay, the way that the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary is completely different. What happens is there is a system known as the hypothalamic, okay, that makes sense, hypophyseal portal system. Okay, the hypophyseal, what does hypophyseal mean? Okay, well this is this comes from the fact that there is another name, unfortunately, for the pituitary gland. So some people, rather than calling the pituitary gland, instead call it the hypophysis, like so. Okay, so this is just the pituitary gland. It's just a fancy piece of terminology that some people will use instead of pituitary gland, but they fundamentally do mean the same thing. Okay, so hypophyseal just means pertaining to the hypophysis, i.e. pertaining to the pituitary gland. So it's the hypothalamic hypophyseal, between the hypothalamus and between the pituitary gland portal system. Okay, right, now what this is it is blood vessels that drain the hypothalamus, go down in the pituitary stalk, and then will supply the anterior pituitary. Okay, so that's what the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system is. Basically, blood that has already gone to the cells of the hypothalamus is now going to go to another place. That's unusual. Usually what happens, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, I'm going to tell you exactly what a portal system is. Usually this is the setup. You go artery, okay, then you have the capillaries. I'll try and show this here. Okay, capillaries, like so. Here we go. These are the capillaries, and then vein. Okay, so this is vein, this is artery, and then it's capillaries. I.e., the blood goes through one piece of tissue and then it goes back to the heart. It does not return into a capillary and be delivered to another tissue. In the case of a portal system, what happens is you have something called a portal vein. So I'm now going to adapt this into a portal system. And then what happens is the portal vein will open up again into capillaries at a second piece of tissue. Okay, and then it will close off again, and then finally it will turn into a vein. Okay, this is what is happening here. You have capillaries in the hypothalamus, they then reconverge into a portal vein, which is the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein. Okay, that's what this is referring to here when we talk about the portal system. Then they reopen again into capillaries in the anterior pituitary. Okay, so this is occurring in the anterior pituitary here. Okay, and then those will reconverge onto a vein. Okay, that is what is meant by a portal system, and these are rare. Okay, you have another very important one in the intestine, but most of your blood does not go through two pieces of tissue before going back to the heart. Okay, right, so what then happens is the cells of the hypothalamus release hormones known as releasing hormones. Okay, an example of which is corticotropin, corticotropin releasing hormone here. Okay, and this will be released into this portal vein here, this hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein. It will go down into the anterior pituitary. Then, of course, you'll have capillaries again, and the hormone is going to act on the cells in the pituitary and trigger the the cells in the anterior pituitary to release some sort of further hormone. Okay, and this is the way that the hypothalamus is going to control the release of hormones by the anterior pituitary. Okay, by first releasing a molecule which then tells these cells in the anterior pituitary to then release another molecule. Okay, so basically the amygdala then has activated the paraventricular nuclei here. Okay, the paraventricular nuclei are then going to release corticotropin releasing hormone, which for short is often abbreviated to CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Okay, corticotropin releasing hormone is going to be secreted into this portal. Well, it's firstly going to be secreted into the capillaries, which will then reconverge into a hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein, and then it's going to go into the capillaries in the anterior pituitary, and there it's going to leave those capillaries, okay, and it's going to act on cells in the anterior pituitary. Now there are loads of different types of cells in the anterior pituitary, okay. The specific cells in the anterior pituitary that corticotropin releasing hormone are going to act on are the corticotropic or corticotrophic cells of the anterior pituitary. Okay, so we'll say here is one of these corticotropic cells here. Okay, I'll colour this in orange here. The CRH is going to stimulate this corticotrophic cell to then release another hormone back into the bloodstream. Okay, and the hormone that the corticotrophic cells of the anterior pituitary gland are going to release is a hormone known as ACTH. Okay, and this stands for adreno, that's the A, cortico, that's the C, and then trophic, or tropic hormone. Okay, so adrenocorticotropic hormone is what ACTH stands for. Okay, and the ACTH is then going to go back into these capillaries here, and then it's going to go into the vein, and then it's going to be drained into the systemic circulation. Okay, the ACTH is then going to make its way to cells in the adrenal gland. Okay, so let me now discuss with you the anatomy of the adrenal glands. I'll draw an adrenal gland here. Okay, so the adrenal glands, you have two of them. They sit above the kidneys. Okay, and they're also sometimes known as the suprarenal glands to make it even more obvious that they are above the kidneys. Suprarenal glands. Okay, now the adrenal glands can each be divided into two separate portions. Okay, there is a central portion shown here, which I will colour now in blue. Okay, and this central portion is known as the adrenal medulla. Okay, so this is the medulla here. Okay, and then there's a peripheral portion, and this peripheral portion of the adrenal glands is known as the adrenal cortex. Now, the adrenal medulla consists of cells that release adrenaline. Okay, that's not what ACTH is going to act on. It's going to act on cells that are in the adrenal cortex. Okay, now the adrenal cortex can be split up further into three separate layers, shown like so. Okay, you have the outermost layer, which is known as zona glomerulosa. So I'll write this here. So the outermost layer of the adrenal cortex is known as zona glomerulosa. Okay, and this layer is responsible for secreting aldosterone. Okay, then the layer underneath zona glomerulosa, I'll have in green here. This is known as zona fasciculata. Okay, so this is zona fasciculata. This is the one that ACTH is actually going to act on. Okay, this secretes glucocorticoids, specifically cortisol in humans. Okay, so we'll come back to that one. Okay, and then underneath the zona fasciculata, the one in turquoise here, this is zona reticularis, and this secretes sex hormones. This I'm just adding to have a complete picture of the adrenal gland here. So this is zona reticularis. Okay, right. So the ACTH that has been secreted into the blood by the corticotrophic cells in the anterior pituitary gland is going to act on the zona fasciculata cells, okay, which are then going to release cortisol into the blood. Okay, now cortisol is what's known as a glucocorticoid. Okay, and what it does is it does many things that are useful in the fear response. Okay, some of the main things that it does, okay, are that it stops inflammation. Okay, so it makes inflammation go down, and in fact, glucocorticoids are actually used clinically as very powerful anti-inflammatory drugs. Now, why is that useful at all to the fear response? Well, think about inflammation. Okay, inflammation generally triggers pain. Okay, if you've got inflammation, let's say in your foot, then it will be causing pain. Okay, do you want that if you are, for instance, about to have to run away? No. You want to reduce inflammation at times when you're about to run away, just in case that inflammation is going to be damaging for your chance of survival, because it's going to reduce your ability to fight or flight, basically. So that's why inflammation is believed to go down in the fear response, okay? And it goes down because of cortisol. Cortisol has a huge number of different anti-inflammatory properties. Okay, so inflammation goes down. Okay, in addition, it raises blood glucose. So blood glucose goes up. That makes sense. If you're going to have to run or fight, you're going to have to use your skeletal muscle. Okay, your skeletal muscle is therefore going to require more glucose. Okay, so blood glucose going up makes sense. The other thing that it does is that it raises energy and it sharpens your cognition. Okay, so it raises your energy, so you feel more energetic, raises energy, and it sharpens cognition, so it makes you think more clearly, basically. Okay, sharpens cognition. Okay, so I'll try and squeeze this in. Sharpens cognition, there we go. Okay, so it makes you think more clearly. Okay, right, so those are the three key effects of cortisol. Okay, right. Now, in the next video, what we will do is we'll discuss how in depression the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is going to be overactive. And by the way, let me just explain why it's now called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So it involves the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus first releases CRH. The pituitary, it involves that because that responds to the CRH and then releases ACTH. And then it involves the adrenal gland because the adrenal gland responds to the ACTH and then releases cortisol. Okay, so that's why this is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, we're going to discuss then in the next video how this axis is going to be overactive in depression. You're going to have chronically high cortisol levels, and unfortunately these nice cognitive effects of cortisol when delivered acutely go when it's delivered long term. If you have cortisol chronically high, unfortunately it doesn't seem to be good for you at all. Okay, and we'll discuss the damage potentially that it causes to the hippocampus.